Well, well, well. It is the end of the semester. Hard to believe, and this semester has absolutely flown by for me, and I'm sure it has for you too, with these 8 weeks. So, today we're going to be tying together a lot of loose ends, and I think um, really gathering together the threads that we've been talking about this whole semester. And so when I say this is the fin de siècle, this it's the end of the century. And so I want us to be thinking about all of the different things that we've been talking about and thinking about the various issues at play at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. Um, there are a lot of things, both positive and negative, going on. So, first of all, to tie together last week's reading and this week's reading, I want to start with what Lears says about what's happening at this moment in time. What about the notion of progress? What about the notion of time? In particular, I think it's really important to think about time and think about this new idea of the mechanization of time, and that time is now becoming money. There's a issue of hurry. There's the taylorization of the body and the workforce. Thinking about the taylorization as being the precursor to Ford's assembly line, that human beings were now becoming mechanized just like the machines that they were supposedly dominating. So you can think about the problems associated with this, especially when thinking about moving away from the land, from the rural setting to these urban centers where you may have very little contact with nature. And there was a neuroscience scientist named Woods Hutchinson who wrote in 1888, once let the human race be cut off from personal contact with the soil, once let the conventionalities and artificial restrictions of so-called civilization interfere with the healthful simplicity of nature, and decay is certain. And so, thinking about what we were talking about last week with the yellow wallpaper and neurasthenia, this is all part of this Nietzschean weightless period, this period that has hazy moral distinctions and vague spiritual commitments, where you have people like Henry Ward Beecher that turn the Calvinist strictures into this more platitudinous humanism. And so Protestant Christianity is losing the gravity of its older, sterner creeds. And so when you're removed from that and you don't have these things mooring you down, there's this weightless culture where focuses are turned to material comfort and kind of the spiritual blandness that is breeding weightless people who are longing for intense experience to give some sort of meaning to their lives. And so, to get into neurasthenia a little bit deeper, it's probably the definition of a first world problem. It's quite simply nervous exhaustion, just to give you some of the symptoms, which I think are kind of hilarious. They include dyspepsia of the stomach, insomnia, tooth decay, hay fever, desire for stimulants and narcotics, fear of responsibility, of open places or closed places, fear of society, fear of being alone, fear of contamination, fear of fears, fear of everything, deficient mental control, lack of decision-making ability, hopelessness, etc. Now, I'm not making light of mental illness. That is absolutely real, but I think the key phrase here is inability to make decisions. It's basically this period in which people felt so unsure and so unable to decide on what they were supposed to do with their lives. They had no driving force. And Beard said that this disease was a product of the post-Civil War era, that neurasthenia was historically important not because nervous ailments had actually increased. That point is impossible to prove, but it's because observers believed that nervousness was on the rise, and so it spread. They treated it spread as a cultural problem. And so you think about the different reasons that we saw in Lear's, the speed of the railway and telegraph that took us out of our normal mind frames, the barrage of information from magazines and newspapers, the repression of emotion, all of these things cause nervousness. You have the authors Edith Wharton, Jack London, Theodore Dreiser, and Kate Chopin, probably most notably Kate Chopin, right? The Awakening. All of these authors have characters that are neurasthenics. And so you have doctors and philosophers speculating at length about the economics of nervous energy. As doctors saw it, the nerve force was a finite thing. So what we have in our bodies are nerves, and when it's too taxed or not properly used, then you have nervous bankruptcy, or neurasthenia was the end result. And as you probably saw on the yellow wallpaper, a lot of times it was due to womanhood and women getting out of their traditional domestic roles as mothers and homemakers, I suppose. But so the only cure for neurasthenia is withdrawal from the pressure of urban life, rest, and a simpler, healthy lifestyle. So I bring this all to the fore today because I think it's really important as a background when we get into the arts and crafts movement and Art Nouveau, art for art's sake, all of these different things at play today. And this really originates in England, and maybe because England had been industrialized for the longest period, it kind of set the trends here. So you have John Ruskin, who was an English critic and an amateur artist, and you can read more about him in your text, but basically his influence are driven by his religious background, and then his protege and fellow Briton, William Morris, was a British textile designer, poet, novelist, translator, and socialist activist. His socialism was really important to him, and this idea that everyone who works should be able to make a living off of what they work on, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But both of these men believed that the industrialized world had taken away man's right to joyful and useful labor, which, if you got back into, this could revitalize culture. And so both also strove to counteract the confusion of forms prevailing at the time by the purifying effect of simple handicrafts and the beauty of natural materials. Now, to unpack that for a minute, think about Victorian architecture and think about maybe interiors of the Victorian era. Not that there's anything wrong with those things, and in fact, I find Victorian houses quite charming, but there's an eclecticism and they're very, very busy, visually speaking. And so basically these two guys are starting to kind of strip away. And there was also what Morris called the age of shoddy, which is basically he's railing against industrialized materials that are creating things that are poorly made and don't last and are not beautiful. And so he's really trying to make everything, even objects of common use, more beautiful. And so he seeks to fix this by emphasizing craftsmanship or reestablishing the link between the hand and the brain, as he calls it, because machine manufacture had severed this link between our hands and our brains. And so he found that beautifully designed and crafted objects could present a way of counteracting the spiritually numbing effects of machine-made goods. So he established workshops in which he made furniture, hand-woven materials, wallpapers, household utensils, you name it. And this wide range of materials is evidence of what he was calling for, which is a Gesamtkunstwerk, and you'll see this phrase a number of different places, but basically it means a total art, a total work of art, an art that would encompass every single aspect of life. And this occurs most often in architecture. A Gesamtkunstwerk is something that is literally from the studs and beams of the house to the doorknobs and dinner plates. It is the total aesthetic control. This art that would encompass every single aspect of life. And so you see this as early as 1859 when he works with architect Philip Webb to build the Red House in Bexley Heath. And what is probably imperceptibly radical about this house, you may look at it and think, well, I see the arts and crafts maybe turn to the medieval, if you've read about that in your text, and that's definitely at play here. But the two things that are pretty remarkable for the time are that A, it's asymmetrical. This freedom from symmetry allowed for innovations in space and was very radical for the trends in British architecture at the time. Also, the trends of British architecture at the time, most of the houses were symmetrical and they were white. They were either made of white stone or stucco. And so here, this red brick is radical, not only for its color, but for its honesty. There were a lot of houses in which they would be made with brick, but then covered with stucco and painted. And so this goes into what Morris is calling for in a real honesty of materials. If you're going to use brick, then let us see that you've used brick. So this is really freeing for architects and designers at the time. And this overall aesthetic need becomes this very international drive. One Chicago sociologist who was a follower of Morris said, he wrote, "Our works and our surroundings corrupt or refine our souls." And so this is kind of a hallmark of the Gesamtkunstwerk, but it's also this return to craftsmanship, return to the arts and crafts era. So just to give you a couple of examples of what is influencing William Morris at this time? Well, we know we've talked so much about Japanese woodblock prints, but here notice especially the asymmetry and the simplicity of form, as well as the simple colors. And so you see in the background one of Morris's wallpapers, and he was absolutely influenced by medieval prints from Britain, or medieval tapestries as well. But here you see also an influx of other Asian cultures, specifically Middle Eastern cultures, in Persian miniatures, or these kind of tapestries that you see here, the same kind of aesthetic, I believe. But I also wanted to turn to another follower of Morris in kind of a different way, and this is the French-Swiss architect and theorist Eugène Viollet-le-Duc. And Viollet-le-Duc is following Morris. He is not necessarily totally against industrialism in the way that Morris is, but he follows Morris in calling for an architecture that's honest, for being absolutely true to the materials that you're using, but also looking back to Gothic medieval forms, to forms before the Renaissance, and to step away from this kind of neoclassical urge. And so here you can see a couple of his designs for a concert hall in which he is combining these very Gothic ribbed groin vaults along with cast iron pillars, which was pretty remarkable for the day. And he also was really into, I just think this is kind of a fun thing to know, this very 19th century idea of restoration. So he says restoration, both the word and the thing are modern. To restore an edifice means neither to maintain it, nor to repair it, nor to rebuild it. It means to reestablish it in a finished state, which may in fact never have existed at any given time. And I bring this in because in the 19th century, you think about what Paris has gone through with the communes and the various wars, and so there has been a lot of damage that's been done to the Cathedral of Notre Dame. And so you see here Viollet-le-Duc's additions to the cathedral, including gargoyles and a self-portrait, which is what's posted here in the circle, but these kind of images that refer to the architect himself, and including things. So this goes back to this idea that it may not necessarily be how it exactly was, but it's reestablishing it here as a modern interpretation of the Gothic era. So I bring this in to kind of talk about bringing all of these things together, this honesty of material, but also this reinterpretation of forms. And this really informs the Art Nouveau movement in particular, as well as the arts and crafts movement. And so I want to start with the Art Nouveau movement and basically talk a little bit about probably the single most important architect and designer of this movement. So in 1893, Victor Horta built a radically new townhouse in Brussels for his friend Emile Tassel. And here we're going to see things that are hallmarks of Art Nouveau. You're going to have this profuse decoration of curving tendril-like lines, and this honesty of material throughout the house. So in his memoir, he said that he wanted an architecture that would create by renouncing architectural styles and relying on the application of clearly visible materials. So I think you can see his debt to Viollet-le-Duc there. So he was very revolutionary. He studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Brussels, and then he became a draftsman for a neoclassical architect, and I could go a little bit further, but he was also a math professor, so he's kind of a polymath. He traveled a good bit. He studied in Paris for 18 months, and He traveled back for the exposition of 1889, which I hope you read about in your book, where the Eiffel Tower was revealed. And this was kind of a watershed moment for him. He was profoundly impressed by the new buildings of iron and glass there, and especially by the Eiffel Tower. And so he was determined to bring these ideas back to Brussels. And you can see this here, this use of iron and mixed media, so to speak, in architecture. That's not necessarily a good term, but you have this very gently curved facade of the Tassel House that's a unique juxtaposition of stone and glass and iron. You have this broad central bank of windows, and you can see how the curved architecture would be different from the fairly rectilinear buildings that are on either side of it. Also, if you look closely, it becomes evident that the columns are not of stone but of encased iron, and that you have this entablature that's metal, complete with exposed rivets. So you have this and you can also see the curved stone as well. At the Hotel Tassel, Horta definitively broke with a traditional house scheme. In fact, he built this house consisting of 3 different parts. So his organization of interior space is quite innovative. And here you can also see maybe how he was freed by the work of Morris and Webb and thinking that things don't have to be necessarily symmetrical or even traditionally made. So you have 2 pretty conventional buildings in brick and natural stone. One is on one side of the street and one is on the side of the garden, but they're linked by this steel structure that is fascinating to me. It's covered with glass, and so then you have this staircase on that functions as the connective part in the spatial composition of the house and contains staircases and landings that connect the different rooms and floors. So this floor plan is really pretty groundbreaking for the time. It's a semi-open plan layout that's hidden behind this more traditional stone facade that I showed you, so that it harmonizes with the more traditional houses next door. But this glass roof here, it functions as a light shaft that brings natural light into the center of the building, which, thanks to the floor plan, has a fluid and pretty symmetrical flow into the main spaces. But here's probably what you would have seen if you've seen anything about this house before. This is where you can really see the whiplash curve that I mentioned before, that we're going to talk about as definitively Art Nouveau. So this is the part of the house that would also be principally used for receiving guests. So you have this kind of flowing T-shaped space, and the living area can be screened off from the dining area. For most historians, the majority of interest concentrates on this really beautifully fluid staircase. You have this open, exposed ironwork that kind of resembles plants underwater, that incorporates a lot of floral ornament, which then spreads onto the surrounding walls in the form of painted decoration, and then onto the floor in this really beautiful mosaic. So you have this tendril-like ornamentation that's flowing from the metal structure to the banisters, to the wallpaper, and the floor mosaics, all of which Horta designed. And so this emphasis on the direct use of a modern material and even the inspiration of natural forms for the metal ornament referenced Viollet-le-Duc's explorations in iron. But so to achieve this integrated design whole, or the Gesamtkunstwerk, he also is really channeling William Morris's call for a total work of art, and insisted on designing all decor elements. You have the stair rail and the painted wall decoration, the mosaic flooring, light fixtures, hardware, and door handles, and even the furniture of the house are elements of his total design. So while the decorations might maybe bring to mind maybe the feel of a Rococo drawing room, the detail here is very modern in the choice of materials and the kind of return to nature. So here you can see too this idea of, while you're using modern materials, you're reincorporating natural forms to try and ground yourself in nature in the home. And this is something I want to think about a good bit today, and this turn to the home as an increasingly natural space, that the home is going to become this kind of sanctuary of domesticity, this place that's a refuge from the increasingly modern industrial urban world. So we're going to see that over and over again. So the materials here, to kind of sum up, you can see how they're not disguised, but they're clearly visible, and each one of them is functioning, but it's also decorative in its own right, and it emphasizes the underlying structure of the house rather than mask it. So this is a pretty good example of Art Nouveau architecture at the time, and I wanted to show you that while Horta clearly understood how to satisfy his client's desire for luxury, like you have here in Hotel Tassel, he's not only a man of the upper crust. In the 1890s, he was commissioned by the Belgian socialist movement to build the Maison du Peuple, which is just fun to say. It was the first building in Belgium to have a predominantly iron and glass facade, which hopefully you might think was made possible by the Crystal Palace in London. But it has a large complex of offices, meeting rooms, conference and concert hall with a seating for up to 2,000 people. It was made for the Socialist Party. Here you can see some of its structure with its plan and elevations. But I think what's really cool is this concert hall. And here I think you can really see possibly the principles of Viollet-le-Duc taken to their logical conclusion. Um, One of the things that I think is really beautiful, it lets in so much light, and he said that light and air had been missing from the working class slums, so he's bringing in plenty in here. He also corrugated the ceilings of the hall to control reverberation, and you have a double gallery that's hung from the steel roof trusses. But again, here I think you can see there's a fluidity of line, and you have this kind of swirling linear like the stems of plants. And so he's trying to bring everything together, tending everything towards unity. Every material, surface, or ornament was harmoniously assembled with this great elegant fluidity and punctuated with these innovative shapes and lines in the midst of it. So from the very large again to the small, his design is total. This is a Gesem Kunstwerk at its finest. And this is nature-influenced design of an iron balustrade. So this is, again, combining industrial with the natural. And he believed that this healing power of a total work of art would help the people. That's why he designed the Maison du Peuple for the people in this way. And so he had these public aspirations for the power of art and the power of good design. And these were taken back to Paris by an architect named Hector Guimard. And here you see his Castel Béranger. And you have this attempt to bring in these Art Nouveau styles here again into the home. And so Guimard had gone to the Paris École des Beaux-Arts from 1885 to the early 1890s, and he was another follower of Viollet-le-Duc. He wrote in 1898 that he had only applied the theories of Viollet-le-Duc without being fascinated by the Middle Ages. So he's stepping away from that a little bit. But then he visited Horta in Brussels, and he was off to the Art Nouveau races. So in 1894, he would begin Castel Béranger, and he would finish it in 1898. And so notice now it's integrated into this fairly continuous urban scheme, but it was once a pretty suburban spot. It dominated its site, and it was surrounded only by low cottages and their gardens. But I think it's really cool how he mixes these materials. You have not only limestone, which was pretty customary for elegant apartment buildings in France from the mid-19th century onwards, but also different colors of brick, along with pierre meulière, this rustic stone that was prized in Parisian suburbs for the domestic look that it gave. You have limestone ashlar on the base, but these other materials, especially the cast iron, really come to life once you step inside. I really think it's remarkable. And here again you see the whiplash curve and the sinuous lines of Art Nouveau at its finest. I just thought this was really too fun not to show you. Here's the interior, the view from inside the courtyard. But really I wanted to bring in Guimard because he was chosen at the turn of the century to design the Paris Metro. And so your book, it talks a good bit about the various expositions, and I hope that you, again, have read about the ones in London and then the Paris Exposition of 1885 and 1889. But this, I think, is really remarkable. The 1900 Paris Universal Exposition really marked Paris for how it is today, how we see it. So he was commissioned to make the entrance gate to the new Paris subway, or the Métropolitain, and so these stations were not only marking an entrance to the new Paris Metro, but it was also a goal of trying to make this new mode of transportation appealing to Parisians. So you have these entrance gates. There are kind of two essential types of kiosks. One has glass roof over it, and the other does not. But they're built out of cast iron, and you can see here how they make reference to the symbolism of plants, and now they're considered classic examples of French Art Nouveau architecture. Over 140 entrances were constructed between 1900 and 1912, of which 86 still exist. If you're looking at the right one, the roofed variety known as edicules, they feature this fan-shaped glass awning, and many, not necessarily all, also featured this enclosure of opaque paneling that were decorated in floral motifs. So you also have this simpler type of entrance on the left that's framed by a Metropolitan sign that's held by two ornate, sinuously curved lampposts. And I think these are really striking in the form of plant stems where the orange lamp is enclosed by a leaf if you look closely. And in particular, you might think of the posters of Toulouse-Lautrec at this time, and this is definitely hand in hand with his Art Nouveau style posters. But it was also in this Universal Exposition that Art Nouveau was spread to an international public. You have this Art Nouveau gallery that you see here on the right that was the German pavilion designed by Bruno Moring. And there, incidentally, you can see a picture from the International Exposition. So it was at this time when, at the exposition, which was largely in the Beaux-Arts style, they began to house and sell goods that were in the Art Nouveau style as well. So you start seeing this become more and more popular. Also, I brought this in to show you Alphonse Mucha, who had designed this mural panel in the Bosnia and Herzegovina pavilion, and you probably know Mucha from his posters. So let's just briefly take a look at those. If we go back to Paris to 1894, before the exposition, we've talked a little bit about Sarah Bernhardt, and she was probably the most famous woman in the world at this point, maybe. She was in a real pickle, though. She needed a new advertising poster for a play that she was in titled Gismonda. And so legend has it that all of the major designers for the print shop were out for the Christmas holidays, and so this young Czechoslovakian or Moravian artist named Alphonse Mucha volunteered to do it, and his poster was plastered all over the city, and it attracted so much attention. And Bernhardt was so pleased with this and so satisfied with the success of this first poster that she essentially began a 6-year contract with Mucha, and he quickly became one of the most sought-after graphic artists in Paris. He created a flurry of advertisements, paintings, posters, book illustrations that began having international attention. Here are a couple other of his posters that he made for Sarah Bernhardt. But notice the kind of simplicity of line, but also this very Art Nouveau font and this lack of symmetry. I think all of these things come into play, as well as this kind of flat coloration. There's not a ton of depth or modeling here, which I think we can also attribute to both medieval prints and Japanese woodblock prints as well. And so, speaking of prints, I also wanted to bring in one of the other kind of forerunners or leaders of Art Nouveau in printmaking, and this is Aubrey Beardsley. And so in 1893, the inaugural issue of The Studio, which was an illustrated magazine of the fine and applied art, reproduced a startling new work by the young English artist Aubrey Beardsley, and it was a illustration for Oscar Wilde's play Salome. And you may remember Salome as being the story from the Bible in which John the Baptist is captured, and Salome is the daughter of Herod's wife, and she dances for Herod, and he is so entranced by her that he says, "What can I give you? You can have whatever you wish." And she's instructed by her mother to say, "The head of John the Baptist on a platter." So essentially, I bring this in. Here you can see some other plates from these illustrations, but you can see Beardsley's Art Nouveau style here, I think, so beautifully. But this is also a really interesting moment as a side note for the growth of the femme fatale. The woman was a very scary and deceptive figure in a lot of both European, British, and American culture in the end of the 19th century. And in large part, that was due to the Salome play that took over the culture, and it was eventually made into a film later on. But if you look here, you see again this bold, sinuous line that's so clear in black and white. This is going to be kind of the hallmark of Art Nouveau design, and some actually regard this particular print as the first two-dimensional work of Art Nouveau. So I think that's kind of important to bring together. And I wanted to skim through that stuff super fast, but also bring it to our attention to kind of tie together what's happening in Europe. But I really want to spend the majority of our time today talking about the Chicago World's Fair, or the Columbian Exposition of 1893. And I'm going to let your classmates in Group 5 talk a little bit about the overall aesthetic of the fair, but I did want to bring in a couple of different things. The World's Columbian Exposition was obviously made in 1893, and you think about what the date there is. It's made 400 years after Columbus supposedly landed in America, or technically the Bahamas. But so it's one to celebrate the 400th anniversary of his arrival, but really it's to show the rest of the world and the rest of the United States the best of Chicago, but also then what American culture had to offer. So a couple of reasons why Chicago was chosen is that by this point in time, it's this hub in the United States. It's literally tying together east and west, and this top map are the railroads, and if you look there, it is this hub where all of these major railroads meet, especially coming from the east, but also coming from the south as well. And there's basically one main railroad line that connects the country to San Francisco. And so here, just to show you, that's a 1870s image, and I think it's great to see because, one, you can see how the rivers are a manifest presence in Chicago, but looking at this in the 1870s, it seems to be a fairly prosaic town. Nothing's too tall. The tallest structures are the church steeples, and namely, think about 1893, Chicago was eager to prove itself because they had just been through the two great fires. And so you have a large portion of downtown Chicago that's absolutely burned to a pulp. And so you have basically the downtown area of Chicago becomes a clean slate for all kinds of new architectural innovations. And there are two other reasons that Chicago then becomes this kind of hub of architectural innovation. One is here on the left side, you see this lovely print of a painting of Elisha Otis and the Otis elevators. And here, I love this. He had basically built the handbrake, and so you see him in his elevator, and he has his assistant cut the rope or the cable holding the elevator up with a sword, and everyone below is terrified, sure that they're about to watch him plummet to his death, but he survived because of his handbrake. So with while that's not necessarily Chicago, that allows for buildings to be taller than 6 stories because that was pretty much what you were limited to as far as being able to walk up at this point. But then notice on the right, this is an earlier facade where you have cast iron, and so they're beginning to try and think about um, structural materials that allow for greater stability of the buildings, trying to think of ways in which they can make buildings fireproof. All of these things kind of come together and make Chicago really this area of percolating architectural interest. And I'm going to come back to that in a second with the other innovations that they make specifically right before the World's Fair begins. So, getting into this a little bit, um, essentially the main charge here was to, again, demonstrate America's technological, artistic, cultural prowess, and they also wanted to compete directly with the 1889 Universal Exposition in Paris that had unveiled the Eiffel Tower. And so they were trying to think of something that would be as remarkable, really, for the world to see. And so they begin thinking about this magic city of 1893 that you have here. And one of the things that was so absolutely astonishing to most of the visitors was how highly electrified everything is. You could walk through at night and have these completely well lit streets. So essentially, I'm going to get into the city itself, but it's this fascinating dichotomy because you have this utopian city, the white city of the fair, that's in just outside of the district of Chicago. Whereas a stone's throw away, you have many inhabitants that live a much darker existence, both literally and figuratively. The actual city of Chicago is known as the Black City, in contrast with the pristine environment of the fair. And think too, if you've read The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, it gives a pretty accurate account of the life of immigrants in Chicago around the turn of the century who lived near the stockyards in the meat packing district. And the smoke, the stench, the filth surrounding these packing operations drove many of the well off to the cleaner suburbs of Chicago, while those who worked in the stockyards continued to live nearby. And if you read that, that will make you think twice about having a hot dog in the near future. I'll tell you that. But many sections of the city that weren't even directly affected by the stockyards were also dirty, smelly, and unsafe. You have garbage that's dumped in the streets, and corpses of animals were left to rot. The water supply was notoriously unhealthy. The hundreds of people, particularly children, died of cholera and other preventable diseases every year. And in fact, the fair organizers were so afraid of a cholera outbreak among the fair visitors that they built a pipeline to bring in clean water from Waukesha, Wisconsin, which was more than 100 miles north. So Chicago was characterized by overcrowded schools, hundreds of brothels, filth, and rampant crime. This English politician named John Burns called Chicago a pocket edition of hell when he visited, and then later he added, on second thought, I think hell is a pocket edition of Chicago. So think about that for a little bit. Thousands and thousands of immigrants lived in these crowded tenement buildings and worked long hours, 6 days a week. The average wage for a meat packer was less than 20 cents an hour, and many, many laborers made far less than that. And most of these poor people probably didn't get to see the White City of the fair except from a distance. And the fair organizers were pressed to provide a waif stay in which poor children would be admitted free of charge, but they refused, which is, nice. And then another dark side of the fair, America saw one of its first serial killers. Dr. H. H. Holmes took advantage of the large quantities of people coming into the city for the fair to create a quote unquote hotel that was actually much more like a torture chamber. If you're into true crime stories, I highly recommend Erik Larson's Devil in the White City. It's fascinating because it has this two-pronged approach to telling the accurate, true history of the fair, both from the gore and the mystery surrounding H. H. Holmes, and then the detailed architectural development that was going on inside the fair, headed by Daniel Burnham, who we'll get to in a second. But I wanted to start out with the idea of the darker aspects of the fair and of Chicago and the era, because I want you to keep this in mind when we talk about the fair and the buildings and exactly what these artists and architects are reacting against and trying to remedy with their designs, and how this correlates into what we've been talking about with Morris, and we're going to come back to, and Horta as well, this ameliorative aspect of design. So this was such a huge deal for the United States. You have articles charting the fair's progress that appeared regularly in newspapers across the country as early as 1890, even in Hawaii, which wasn't even a state yet. So they chronicled the fair throughout the duration of the exposition. And one of the things I think you should note is that while it's also about technology, the architecture was really the lens, the framework through which the message of the World's Fair was to be viewed. So the beauty and the splendor permeates the public imagination throughout the United States. And the creators took great pains to construct a specific narrative of progress. They were positing the United States as the culmination of modern civilization. When you think about prior to the exposition in regard to cultural or intellectual development, the United States had consistently been considered, in its own estimation as well as in the judgment of most established European cultures, as kind of this inferior sibling compared to the rest of the Western world. So the fair becomes this ideal vehicle for the display of our contribution to the forward progress of civilization. So you could demonstrate this through a number of different industrial or mechanical displays, by the thousands upon thousands of works of art on display, which we're going to talk about in a second, but by the buildings which house them all. So the land that they were given was Jackson Park, which was this kind of desert of sand with stagnant pools of water that was some marshy soil that's not ideal at all for laying foundations. And it was going to have to be transformed for the fair, and the bedrock lay 125 feet below grade, which was way too deep for workers to reach with any kind of economy or safety using the construction methods available in the 1880s. And so below this level, the surface was a mixture of sand and clay that was so saturated with water that the engineers actually called it gumbo. And it compressed under the weight of even small, modest buildings, and it drove architects, as a matter of routine, to design their buildings with sidewalks that intersected the first story above grade, in hopes that when the building settled and dragged the sidewalks down with it, the walks would be level with the ground. So you have these two men that really are overseeing everything: Daniel Burnham and his partner John Wellborn Root. And Root, who is Burnham's partner, first came up with a solution on how to do this, and he envisioned digging down to the first kind of reasonably firm layer of clay that's known as hardpan, and then spreading a pan of concrete, and then you would set layer upon layer of steel rails on top of each other. And once it was complete, this grillage or grillage of steel would be filled and covered with cement, making this kind of raft. And he called it a floating foundation. So basically what he's doing is giving a stratum of artificial bedrock that would also serve as the floor of the basement. So think about this if you're looking at these foundations, and while this may be kind of difficult to wrap your mind around, this is going to make skyscrapers possible. This is going to allow for a lot of mass in a relatively small amount of square footage to be able to be solid and to be able to be safe. And so this is how Chicago really becomes the first place in which we see skyscrapers in the years after this. But so you have this as part of the foundations for the architecture. And notice here the style that permeates this entire thing. This is all unified around a neoclassical Beaux-Arts vision of Daniel Burnham's. And so he's really trying to convey this idea that we are the pinnacle of civilization, right? Over and over again, journals, letters, reminiscences all celebrate the beauty and the serenity of this Columbian Exposition. The well-managed and seemingly uncorrupt fair had unbelievably clean streets, well-behaved crowds, the most advanced sanitary and transportation systems, and most of all, it was beautiful. It was so unlike the gray and dusty cities that many of the visitors had come from. in many respects, the fair was in fact a utopia of sorts. And so you have all of these styles that represent order, tradition, purity, and grandeur, all of the things that America was trying to display. You have extensive use of columns, domes, vaulted ceilings, ornate sculptural ornamentation, symmetry, and balance. And these are all characterizing, especially these buildings that are surrounding this central court of honor or the Grand Basin, as you can see. So it's kind of a combination of Rome meets Venice. And here's a map of the overall thing. But what's fascinating about this to me, and I'll come back to this map in a second, is that just 8 years before the opening of the fair, William Jenney, who was where Burnham got his architectural start at his firm, actually, but he had created the home insurance building with the first steel frame. And so it's notable that while all of the buildings of the fair look like they might be made out of marble, they're all actually created with these steel frames and then covered with stucco and then applied with white spray paint, which was actually an invention of the fair's contractor. So this brought each building under the same exact color scheme, which we'll come back to in a second. But this was kind of unthinkable for a lot of the architecture critics at the time, who derided these structures as decorated sheds. So, because they thought that this was not permanent, and indeed it wasn't. Most of these buildings are no longer here, although that's because there was another fire that would run through this later. But, so there are 14 main buildings that are centered around this giant reflective pool. I'm not going to talk about all of them. But one thing I do think it's fascinating to note about is this Columbian fountain that was designed by Frederick McMonnies. And it's here right when you walk into the fair. And so I'll go to this other angle of it where you can see Columbia herself, who is enthroned up top, who is led by Fame in front. And the ship is guided by Father Time, who is actually stuck his scythe in that column to steer the ship as a rudder. And then you have the muses that are paddling it along. So this is the land itself kind of anthropomorphized into this female figure of Columbia. And then you have these seahorses, if you can look on the right side. They're pairs of seahorses that have really strong horse bodies, obviously, and kind of a mermaid tail in the back, but they are led by music, architecture, sculpture, and painting, the figures representing those different things. So this is right what you'd see as you get into the Grand Basin, but also what you can't really tell from those images, but maybe from this print, is that the fountains were really remarkable for most of the visitors, that the general effect was incredible. Most people were astonished, and this was the kind of chief enjoyment of just sitting nearby and watching this. And they even had multicolored lights that would play. That was another invention. I'll show you an image of that in a second, I think. But across that, looking back at that, you have this depiction of the Republic by Daniel Chester French, and this is gilt bronze. So the other, I will go back and say, the McMonnies statue is of staff, fiber, and plaster with that same steel base. But here you have the Republic, and so you have her wearing a laurel wreath, holding a orb with the eagle on top, and then she's got this spear or staff of sorts that's topped with a Phrygian cap. Can you see that? So I think it's kind of beautiful. There is this overarching theme here, and in fact, Burnham had hired Augustus St. Gaudens to oversee all of the sculptural decorations so that there would be a common theme. But so you have the land of Columbiana, I guess is what they would call it. So the land itself looking across at the abstract ideal of the republic or the government. The two things that make America what it is are engaging across this Grand Basin. So all of this is kind of framed by this gorgeous colonnaded peristyle. You can see that from behind. So again, there are a number of different buildings we could talk about, but one thing I do want to draw your attention to is the Women's Building, which was designed by Sophia Hayden. And she is the first woman to receive a degree in architecture from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology of MIT. And she designed the Women's Building, and it was the only structure designed by a woman at the fair. And unfortunately, she got so much pushback of the critics that it drove her to a nervous breakdown. That's not funny. But she eventually gave up her aspirations as an architect. But here you can just see it's a little bit more simple than the other structures, but I also wanted to draw our attention to these murals. She worked with Mary Fairchild McMonnies, who is the wife of Frederick McMonnies, and Mary Cassatt to do these large murals. It's kind of difficult to see this, but this is Primitive Woman, the McMonnies did, and you can see basically women are carrying water, cooking, caring for children, caring for warriors coming home. And this went across this main gallery from Modern Woman by Mary Cassatt. And if you look and notice here's some detailed images of it. And there you can see the color scheme. That's a sketch of hers. And here is one more. So you can see this is a preparatory sketch, so you can really get a good idea of the color. But notice here, oops, I didn't mean to do that. There you go. So notice here what's happening. There are no men. Women are picking fruit. So again, kind of drawing on and flipping the traditional understanding of Eve, right? This is definitely something Mary Cassatt is doing on purpose. So kind of getting this idyllic scene, and all these women are in modern dress, and then on the right side you have a woman playing the guitar, one's dancing, so kind of talking about the different achievements of women, or the different kind of things that women could do. On the left you have 3 little girls that are chasing a winged figure of fame, but they're also being chased by geese and ducks, so kind of those things represent the normal trappings of femininity, that women are unable to attain fame because of these other things. Anyway, I just think this is kind of great. And since we've been talking about Mary Cassatt, I thought it was appropriate. But all this to say, I wanted to also show you the one building that wasn't monochrome white, and it wasn't Beaux-Arts neoclassical style. This is the Transportation Building that was designed by Louis Sullivan, and this is, I think, kind of one of the end points of 19th century architecture, and really forward-looking to what will happen in the 20th century. And you may or may not know about Louis Sullivan. Essentially, he writes an essay later called The Tall Office Building Artistically Considered, where he coins the phrase form follows function. So you can see that here in this polychromed building. It's going back to the kind of Romanesque era, the colors of Pompeii. Anyways, it was an enormous building that had these gold doors that was kind of the talk of the entire exposition. And Daniel Burnham was not too happy that he wouldn't fit in the color scheme, and so he actually set this back off of the main thoroughfare, that it wouldn't be necessarily visible right away, because it was slightly different in appearance. So inside, just if you're curious, it was divided into 3 parts: a railway, marine, and vehicle transportation. So they actually had various kinds of boats inside, as well as a train and American cars. And then there were all these kind of elevators, different things that you can see, as well as a rooftop promenade, which you can see there. But anyway, I think I'll let your classmates talk more about this painting by Curran, but there you can see the various colors of these multicolored lights and the kind of effect at night. One other thing to notice, so here you have this beautiful wooded aisle in the center, and the lands of this and the waterways of this exposition were all designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, who had designed Central Park, and this was kind of his swan song, so to speak. And everyone talked about how amazing the landscaping was. But on the central aisle, you had the Japanese pavilion, and this was going to be shocking for so many people in a good way, that they hadn't really seen architecture like this before, or this idea of this totally unified space inside. And so young architects like um, Charles and Henry Green, who we're going to talk about in a minute, Bernard Maybeck, and Frank Lloyd Wright would all visit these and just be totally wowed by these structures. So we're going to come back to this in a second. But you have all of these different international pavilions that are here. Nearly 50 foreign countries and 43 different states and territories were represented here. But I wanted to draw your attention. This is kind of a pixelated image for sure, but it's a poster from this era. And notice the progression. You have this white building at the top representing civilization, and then it goes down to these African bushmen at the bottom. And I bring this in to show us the kind of more insidious aspect of the fair, that there was a definite cultural hegemony that they're trying to convey. And there is certain aspects of African Americans weren't even allowed as visitors in here. And you had these live exhibits just like you did in the Parisian Exposition, kind of showing these savages, quote unquote, for as how they would actually live with their huts and teepees and things like that. But this is really to make the white people feel good, and it's really kind of remarkable and a sobering thing for us to think about, right? That you have this notion of progress, and that what is at the top of our progress, what is the ultimate goal, and that is our kind of white, both literally and figuratively, culture. But all this to say, I bring this in because the aesthetic of the exposition in its entirety is meant to convey this kind of new sort of utopian metropolis that was, in essence, American, even though it's drawing on the architecture incorporating cultural elements of other eras and civilizations. And Henry Adams, who's this American historian of the time, said, Chicago asked in 1893 for the first time the question whether the American people knew where they were driving. Chicago was the first expression of American thought as a unity. One must start there. So, in many ways, this is the first time in which Americans are trying to figure out if there is a national identity. And in many ways, our modern American imagination finds its first embodiment here in the visual presence of the Columbian Exposition. After walking the streets of the White City, Frank L. Baum watched from below as Samuel Archer King took a young girl above the fair in a hot air balloon in late September. And of course, Frank L. Baum wrote The Wizard of Oz. Elias Disney, a Chicago carpenter who helped build the exposition, undoubtedly recounted stories of the fair's magical environment to his son Walt, who would then convey it into his own construction of a permanent World's Fair in Disneyland. Amusement parks, including Disneyland, became a truly American pastime in the years that followed the exposition. And so their roots are probably traced not only to the Midway, which you actually have here for the first time, you can see it in the back, which was designed to sell products and further the kind of capitalist aims of the fair and promote cultural tourism. That's where you saw a number of those different exhibits of the live cultures. But it also revealed this feat of American engineering that was meant to answer the call for a rival construction for the Paris Exposition's Eiffel Tower. But here notice that our answer to that is geared, forgive the pun, towards amusement. You have George Ferris design this gravity-defying wheel, and he made this with steel, and it was supposedly quite the fearful thing that people would gather around because they were just sure that it would tip over, which is kind of hilarious to think about. Also, William James, who is one of my favorite writers of the time, he wrote to his brother Henry, the novelist Henry James, about the White City, saying, "But everyone says one ought to sell all one has and mortgage one's soul to go there. It is esteemed such a revelation of beauty. People cast away all sin and baseness, burst into tears, and grow religious under the influence." Think about that for a moment. This idea that beauty and religion are tied hand in hand. And so I want to think about that for a second to tie these things together about this conflation of the aesthetic and the religious that took place at the exposition. And this is not just Henry James that says that, but it's kind of encapsulated in that statement that makes this particular event, the Chicago Exposition, as this pivotal moment in the ideal um, cultural summation of studying art and religion in the 19th century. One of the things that I wanted to talk about is that we have this parliament of world religions that takes place during the exposition in Chicago, and some of it happened in the Palace of Fine Arts, and I'm going to come back to that in a second. One thing I did want to mention about the Palace of Fine Arts is that this is the first time in which a lot of Americans saw what was happening in Europe in the art world, but this is also a time for American artists to show them their work on an international stage. And you can see there were thousands upon thousands of works of art being displayed, and they had this pamphlet that was passed around, or that they passed out so that you could view and know which works of art were which. But it also gave this kind of apology, and I mean that as kind of an explanation for an endorsement of American art as its own entity that was coming into its prime. So this kind of moment, and you see that especially in works in some of the galleries by Akins. If you look up there on the top right, you have his kind of follow-up to the Gross Clinic, if you've noticed that, and then John Vanderline, a couple of other folks. But you have art being kind of shown by both international folks and by Americans. So bringing all of these things together, really highlighting cultural prowess. And there you see the French Room below as well. But to get to the Parliament of World Religions just for a moment, I think it's notable to talk about this because this is also the first time in which not only ecumenicism within the Christian church was celebrated, but there was also a real push for religious tolerance between religions. You have Judaism being celebrated. Also, I think it's worth it to note that this is the first time that most Protestants are cool with Catholics coming into the fold as Christian denominations. But also, you have Buddhists. The Swami Vivekananda comes, and this is a really big moment for them. But this becomes this kind of paradigm of possibility for the minds in the minds of many of the exposition's attendees. And there's this religious emphasis to the fair and by extension to the modern world. John Henry Barrows, who opened the Parliament of the World's Religions with this big speech, calls America the Jubilee of Civilizations. And so I guess there's a lot I could say here, but to kind of tie it up, American religious historian Richard Hughes Seeger refers to the Parliament as the second major hinge or turning point of religion in international history. So he says that the first major turning point in our culture happened during the Revolutionary era, where Protestant religion absorbed various Enlightenment ideals and kind of responding to the American Revolution and the frameworks of the new governmental structure. But the second hinge took place now, during the Parliament of World Religions. And this is when these immigrant communities and their religious institutions were recognized as forces to be reckoned with within the American culture and the history of the United States. And so you have this representative moment of the broadening and diversification of the American religious mainstream. Again, delegates of Judaism, Buddhism, Jainism, Islam, Hinduism from multiple countries joined with several denominations of Christianity for 17 days to address the changing and dynamic character of religion in this rapidly modernizing world. And most of these people who are getting together, I think it's fascinating that their goal is to unite religion against irreligion. So to unite under this banner of faith in general, which I think is pretty cool. So this Buddhist speaker got up and spoke of a program of tolerance and universal peace between the world's religion, saying, "Why do I come here today? Because I find in this new city and this land of freedom the very place where that program can again be carried out, this program of tolerance and universal peace." So, this assertion underscores this past and present and future of religious freedom in the United States. I think that's really beautiful here. That the urban United States had become this realm of possibility in which interreligious dialogue was not just possible but celebrated. And so think about that as that being this really formative moment in opening up the world to tolerant or religious tolerance. But also it marks this end as well. It marks the end of the formative era in American history, the closing of the frontier, according to Frederick Jackson Turner in this frontier thesis. And basically, he says that, the frontier was what defined America, thinking about the cowboys in the West. And so, with the frontier now being closed for settling, how are we going to define ourselves? This is this pivotal moment. So the exposition, I think, is the larger embodiment of that, of how are we as Americans going to define ourselves artistically, religiously, industrially, technologically, or generally culturally speaking. So moving in, I just wanted to show you, thinking about this industrialization, thinking about this new urbanity, that I also wanted to bring in California arts and crafts just to show you some examples. And this becomes kind of one of our true, if we're thinking about a national imagination, I want to think about this arts and crafts movement situated in California because I think it's this fascinating national style that emerges as it's derived from the teachings of Ruskin and Morris and is all about um, globalization. And you'll see what I mean in a second. I mainly want to stick with architecture here, and I'm going to show you a few examples of different kinds. One, because so many of you are in California and may have a chance to actually see some of these, and two, because I think seeing so many of the works of arts and crafts and their overlaps really helps to get a sense of the breadth and depth of the movement. So obviously one thing to note is the distinctly Californian emphasis on blurring the lines of nationality, and this West Coast is kind of the gateway to Asian culture, and as we saw, was already influential in the World's Fair of 1893. I could get into this a little bit, but I'm not. This is Berkeley. But I want to talk about the Swedenborgian Church, and as a quick aside, you may not know who Swedenborg is. He was a philosopher, theologian, and scholar in the 18th century. He made a lot of inventions, and for that reason, he was called the Swedish Leonardo da Vinci. But his writings inspired a number of Protestants who would actually form a church around his teachings, somewhat loosely Christian, though stepping away from traditional doctrine. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Helen Keller, Jake and Maggie Gyllenhaal are all Swedenborgians, but I digress. But so you have Swedenborg. I think his main tenet, the main important thing that I would have you know about him is that he wrote about the correspondences, and correspondences being things in nature that can teach us about God's character. And so that fits in with arts and crafts ideals, I think, for sure. But you have the Swedenborgian Church in San Francisco, which is this beautiful little tiny gem of a church that's tucked away in the Pacific Heights neighborhood. And here you have A. Page Brown as the nominal architect, but a young guy named Bernard Maybeck is probably the main draftsman of this church, and we're going to talk about Maybeck in a second. But I wanted to show you the lot itself. You walk in this gate and you see first and foremost a perfectly manicured garden. So this is this emphasis on nature. And then as you step inside, you see the sanctuary itself is pretty simple, but notice the piers and the columns. They are actually tree trunks, right? They're not even stripped. The bark is still there. So this is incredibly natural, raw emphasis of nature here. The interior of the sanctuary is pretty much unchanged since 1895. So you have the lower portion of the sanctuary walls that's clad in Oregon pine, which we now call Douglas fir, and this wainscoting. Um, and then above the wainscoting, you have hand textured lime plaster, and this large offset fireplace, which I think is so beautiful. And it's actually in, uh, intentionally off center. It does this asymmetry suggest the imperfections of vernacular architecture, but it's also reflecting the hand of the individual craftsman rather than this finish of an architectural plan. Also, think about the theological implications here that we are all kind of works in progress. But I could get into it a good bit more. Notice on the side of the wall, on the right side, you have four paintings of the seasons by William Keith. And here you can see some of the trees in better detail. And then at the front, there's a stained glass of nature and then a number of different tree trunks as well. But I really wanted to talk about Bernard Maybeck, who got his start with A. Page Brown and talks about the Swedenborgian church as being really formative for him. And so, getting a little bit into his history, he was born to German immigrant parents. He went and studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and then he returned to New York in 1886 and then moved back to the Bay Area after stopping in 1893 in the Columbian Exposition to see the California building where he helped the construction there, and he saw the Japanese pavilion for the first time, and he was struck by its simple geometry and its use of timber. Um, he was also very theatrical. You can see here in the designs that he made for his wife and of costumes that he made for his wife and children. But he was not just arts and crafts related, he was incredibly eclectic, and he'd become really popular after the turn of the century. If you go into Berkeley and Google Maybeck houses, there's a whole listing of them because locally living in a Maybeck house is kind of like living in a Monet. It's highly coveted. And unfortunately, I don't have too many examples here for you, but I did want to show you this particular emphasis of his. He works with Florence Boynton, who was childhood friends with Isadora Duncan, who pioneered modern dance and freeform movement. And she created this home and dance school that reflects Isadora Duncan's theories and inspirations. But you see here at the bottom, they're kind of local celebrities. Um, she and her children are singing to the rose tints in the sky. These are the true bohemian, you guys. But so she commissioned Maybeck to build this Temple of the Wings, and it was originally designed and constructed as this Greco-Roman colonnaded open-air residence, and it was also perched on one of the Berkeley Hills, so they would have this panoramic view of the bay. But this back to nature aesthetic was taken to the extreme by Boynton and Maybeck, who got rid of walls and windows for open air spaces that could instead just be draped with heavy curtains in bad weather. So it had two units, living units on either side of this U-shaped courtyard, and there's a picture that I took here in the bottom. You can still see it. It's actually bought by the Getty family, and they actually enclosed it with walls for practical living purposes. But I bring this in because this shows us this effort to get back to nature and also to connect with earlier times, even if this is neoclassical, not quite arts and crafts. But this is, enhancing this kind of interrelationship of art and daily life, and it was uh, kind of symbolic of Berkeley's reputation at the turn of the 20th century as the Athens of the West, thanks to their university. And I show you this because I wanted to bring it to your attention and show you Maybeck's versatility and interest in all styles and eras, because it's this that really marks his masterpiece, which is the First Church of Christ Scientist, also in Berkeley. And it's one of our nation's most creative and stylistically diverse buildings. And most people actually say, he's a contemporary of Frank Lloyd Wright. And the reason that Frank Lloyd Wright is so famous now, one is that he's incredibly talented, obviously, but two, he was a shameless self-promoter, and Maybeck was very reserved. But here you can see some really beautiful innovations as well as the wisteria, which I love in its own. But one thing I would call your attention to is that he's merging industrial materials as well with this kind of arts and crafts aesthetic of letting things be honest, but he was very concerned about fires. So you have this asbestos siding here and industrial windows. I think I have some better images of those that are actually made, but they're they should remind you of the Japanese architecture, right? I think I have, yeah, there you go. As well as the kind of jutting eaves where you have the beam ends, and so he's trying to engage in these different styles to express more traditional forms. Um, I could show you a good bit more. I'm just going to show you some images. Here's the inside, which is absolutely breathtaking. And this is where his eclecticism is really, really apparent. And he utilizes concrete because he's, again, concerned about fires, but you can see how he utilizes that to make this incredibly open space. Here's the floor plan. It's in the shape of a Greek cross, so equal-sided. And I wanted to show you here, you can see the vault as well, the detailing there. But if you look at the capitals, they're all miniature churches with these Romanesque arches as well. Just so incredibly gorgeous. And in the pulpit in the First Church of Christ Scientist, there's no one speaker, so they're trying to show equality here. But if you notice, he's trying to engage with the honesty of materials, and these are made out of concrete. And if you notice, there are those little kind of squiggly lines in there, and this is the paper that was from the mold of the concrete for this, and he decided to leave that there, and instead, rather than smooth it out, he turned it into that very floral natural motif, which is pretty amazing. And so then to move south down to Pasadena and area not too far from Azusa, I want to move to the Greens a little bit, Charles and Henry Green, because these guys are unbelievable. And these are really arts and crafts architects at their finest, especially the Gamble House, which is pretty much their masterpiece, their masterwork. They were born in Ohio, then they moved to St. Louis. They went to MIT in Boston, where they were in the architecture program. And Charles had a 4-month honeymoon with his new wife in England and Scotland and Europe. And this is where he was introduced to Ruskin and Morris. And his interest in the English arts and craft movement was really sparked here. And I think you can see their commitment to handmade and natural materials and a connection to the landscape. These are all arts and crafts movement ideas. They also embrace the Gesamtkunstwerk concept, the idea of creating this whole unified concept, choosing every single item of the house from the handrail to the dinner plates. And they worked to eliminate everything that was unnecessary to make the unified whole as direct and simple as possible, but always with beauty as the end result. So it was made for the Procter & Gamble company, founder David and Mary Gamble. And there are a number of different things that I could say about this, but I want to move to the interior because I think that's where it really shines. There are over 28 different kinds of wood, and this is where you really see their attention to detail and their idea to have the honesty of the material speak for itself. So here you can see, again, these jutting eaves with the exposed end beams, very reminiscent of Japanese architecture. But when I was talking earlier about this being incredibly international, if you look here in the entryway, which first of all, notice the stained glass door, which is beautiful, opalescent stained glass, which is a whole nother thing that I wish we had time to talk about. But you have teak, mahogany, ebony. These are all woods that are not found in the Pacific Southwest or Northwest, really, for that matter. These are found in South America, Southeast Asia. So we have this increasing global trade, this global economy that makes this construction possible. So thinking about attention to detail, I think it's really amazing. They are also keenly interested in olfactory presence, so they choose woods also for their smell, so that each room has a specific aroma, which is just amazing. They were incredible, incredible woodworkers. You have this fascination with carpentry and detail. Everything is to be honest, to highlight structural detail and joinery. You have pier and beam structural systems with this kind of balloon frame method. I don't know how familiar you are with architecture, but it's pretty simple, yet everything has incredible detail, incredible finish. Here again is the front door, the entryway, the dining room. Notice all the built-ins. Sitting room, the bedroom. Notice that all these bedrooms have sleeping porches. The attic. Again, look at the detail in the attic. Even these joists up here with this beautiful metal joinery. And here from the sleeping porches, you can look out over the Arroyo Seco. So they're really trying to engage with the landscape and really make it harmonize. But just to give you an example of their attention to detail and their woodworking, this is one direction for one piece of furniture. They designed all the furniture for this as well. And so notice Charles says, all exposed surfaces of woodwork shall be sanded perfectly smooth with 00 sandpaper and given a coat of Wheeler paste filler, wiping across the grain to remove surplus filler. 48 hours or more after the filler has been applied, the work shall be sanded a second time over the whole surface with 40 sandpaper and given a coat of raw linseed oil with proper amount of dryer. Oil shall be applied over a small amount of surface and immediately wiped off with clean cheesecloth. After this last process and work has been allowed to stand a sufficient time, it shall be repeated. To the oil of this final coat shall be added a small amount of Pratt and Lambert 61 quick drying varnish. After this, polish the whole with clean cheesecloth. This is for one aspect of this house. This detail, apparently the finish on Green and Green, is unlike anything you would imagine, that it's silky smooth to the touch. And here you can see some of their joinery, their dovetailing. And here to show you one of what I mean by it's very tactile. Notice how the ebony pegs project out just the tiniest hint. I think it's an 1/8 of an inch, and then you have the abalone inlay. But so just this attention to detail over and over again. These are light plates that are drawn on, I think, Japanese samurai sword hilts. Anyway, there's just so much to be pulled from in this as well. And then notice the simplicity here. These are the servants' quarters. And most American families, well, not most, but 1 out of 12 American families had live-in help. So it's not, while the Gambles were incredibly wealthy, it's not that unheard of at the time. But notice that there's a simplicity of form, and they use different wood in the back of the house where the servants lived. So even someone who was blind and couldn't see where they were going would be able to feel their way and smell their way to the servants' quarters. But even still, the simplicity of form, I think, is really amazing. But from here, I want to finish today by talking about Whistler. And this may seem like a kind of odd jump. And I do this because I want to talk about Ruskin a little bit more in tandem with Whistler. They're kind of arch enemies. But Whistler is working at this time and comes to push forward the aesthetic movement, which is this effort to bring more beauty into everyday life. And I think this is something that we can pull from everything that we've seen today. And I'm going to talk about 2 different public disputes that he gets into over artworks. And I think Whistler's entanglements are really important for us as we finish because they bring in a couple of different aspects that we have been kind of skirting around all semester. One is the emergence of art critics. Ruskin was this incredibly influential critic, and a negative review could be disastrous. And there were a number of new critics and publications that were influencing public opinion. So we see Whistler engaging with this. And secondly, we learn about Whistler's notion of artistic free will, and whether that means that artworks are fundamentally the expression of a particular artist's thoughts or desires. That idea kind of seems obvious today, that a work of art is a representation of that artist's thoughts or desires. But that wasn't really the case in the mid-19th century up to this point. Most people thought that artwork existed to participate within the canon of tradition. And Whistler, we'll see, kind of begins to buck that. Also, the other idea of artistic free will is important when you get into thinking about commissions and payment. And Whistler is really kind of fun to look at for both of these reasons. So, to give a background of truly how groundbreaking he was, he starts the aesthetic movement and was working in this beautiful kind of loose brushwork here, um, like John Singer Sargent and William Merritt Chase 2 or 3 decades before they hit the scene. He also essentially will usher in the idea of abstraction, whether through his titles or through his compositions. And here we see that. This is Symphony in White #1, The White Girl. So first and foremost, it's this kind of abstract thought. And he takes a cue from a critic who had referred to this portrait of his mistress as a symphony in white. So then he begins to think about and entitle his works with the abstract language of music. He calls them symphonies, compositions, harmonies, nocturnes, arrangements, and so forth. And think about what that means. Because music doesn't necessarily have a specific narrative. I mean, some does, obviously, but music is more about tone, about feeling. This is an incredibly modern way to think about things. This painting actually bears the distinction of being the first work to truly achieve fame for artists. It was rejected by the London's Royal Academy and the French Academy Salon for inappropriate subject matter and seemed to suggest the loss of innocence. So that's why it was inappropriate. But it appeared at the Salon des Refuses in 1863, which we already talked about, where it was greatly admired by Manet, Courbet, and Baudelaire, among others. So Symphony in White is his kind of shift. He's been working in the realist style up to this point, and he's developing his own signature abstract style at this point, where he's focusing on using subtle color variations, texture, and careful balancing of forms or shape to convey a mood that's going to appeal to the senses. I mean, you actually feel like you could reach out and touch that rug and understand what these different textures are at play here. This is probably his most famous. You guys have all seen the portrait of the artist's mother, where his mom is seated in a long black dress with a simple white cap. She's seated in profile. She's steadily gazing ahead while holding a white handkerchief on her lap. But notice the title again, Arrangement in Gray and Black, #1. I think this is so sweet. On the wall behind her, there's this reproduction of Whistler's view of the Thames. And you have Japanese-inspired floral patterning on the curtain hanging at the left. And so this is, again, kind of tying in Japanese aesthetic. And notice the kind of circular motif at the top of the curtain. That is his stylized butterfly signature. So anyway, all that to say, this is an arrangement of form that appears pretty simple when in fact there's a careful balancing of shapes. It's asymmetrical. So there's a lot at play here. For example, the rectangular shapes of the picture on the wall and the curtain on the left and the floor, they help to stabilize the sitter's form. So she was religiously devout, and she had been living with her son in his London home for 7 years when he asked her to pose for him after a model canceled a scheduled session. And so she was 67 at this point, even though she looks much older, and she found it difficult to stand for extended periods of time. And so he changed the pose for a seated position for her comfort, and then it essentially took off from there and was incredibly well known. But here is where things start to get fun, if you didn't find that fun before. So Nocturne in Black and Gold from 1875 was the last of his nocturnes and one of only 6 depicting London's Cremorne Gardens. So this is also called The Falling Rocket, and it presents an explosion of fireworks in the night sky, but rather than giving us this concrete image, he's instead conveying the effect of fireworks over the river. And in doing so, he's capturing the sense of excitement or celebration. You have loose brush strokes, dark blues and greens, small bursts of bright color, and this composition conveys what Whistler describes as this dreamy, pensive mood rather than a clear narrative. And think about that for a minute. In a way, he's taking romanticism to the nth degree. He's trying to convey mood. He's foreshadowing abstract expressionism. You have this mass of shadowy dark hues, vague wandering figures, splashes of brilliant color. And it's really these fireworks that become the fireworks between him and Ruskin. It's now considered one of the most important examples of his kind of bridge to abstraction, which I think you can see why, but it was not well received when it was first exhibited. Some viewers questioned the merit of such seemingly convoluted subject matter, while others disliked what they considered to be his reckless and careless painting technique. So John Ruskin produced a negative review of this painting in 1877. And then, after his negative review, Whistler sued him for libel, submitting this canvas along with another one of his nocturne paintings as evidence. And Ruskin's combination of the artist's work as representation of the modern school was in fact accurate. However, he also said that Whistler was a charlatan whose only aim was to swindle art collectors of their money. So the case went to court in 1878, and Ruskin's attorney, John Holker, questioned the success of Nocturne in Black Gold, and he asked Whistler, "Do you think you could make me see beauty in that picture?" And Whistler replied, "No, I fear it would be as impossible as for the musician to pour his notes into the ear of a deaf man." It's pretty big slam. But basically, Ruskin accused Whistler of slinging paint on the canvas. And so it gets to be this kind of back and forth on what should art be at this time. And you essentially see they ask Whistler, how long did it take you long to paint the Nocturne in Black and Gold? How soon did you knock it off? And Whistler then replied, "Oh, I knock it off in a couple of days." And then the barrister asked Whistler if it was merely the labor of 2 days, for which he charged more than £200. And Whistler responds to this and says, "No, I asked for the knowledge of a lifetime." So he's saying all this to say, he says that his own experience, his work, is what adds worth to his artwork. That his own perception is what's important here. And so this is where he is essentially grappling with who gets the final say in the public's eye of how much a work of art is worth, or whether it is qualitatively good anyway. Is it the critic or the artist himself? Whistler actually won the case, but his victory had pretty sadly ironic consequences for him. The judge awarded him only 1 farthing, which was less than a penny, in damages, and required Whistler to pay all of the court costs, which ruined him financially. But notice this, that his method of flicking paint at the canvas to create their fireworks in this painting was appropriated by later modern artists, most notably Jackson Pollock. And then finally, I wanted to show us the Peacock Room, named for the birds that he painted on its shutters and walls. And I want to get into a little bit his first significant patron, Leyland. And Leland had hired Thomas Jekyll, who was a prominent architect, to design a display space for his mostly blue and white Qing Dynasty porcelain collection. And he had already bought the princess that you see here, and it was hung over the fireplace. And so he consulted Whistler about the room's color scheme, the architect and the designer Jekyll did, I should say. And then Jekyll, having health problems, stopped overseeing the work, and Whistler pressed on, and he added many design details, including the peacocks and the shutters. So in a letter to his patron, he promised a gorgeous surprise, and Leland was surprised all right by embellishments far more extensive and expensive, about $200,000 worth today, over budget, more than what he had anticipated. And so he said, "I do not think you should have involved me in such a large expenditure without previously telling me of it." And he admonished him, and he agreed to pay only half. And so then Whistler goes in and paints 2 peacocks on the wall opposite the princess, which you see here. And the birds face each other on ground strewn with silver shillings, as if about to fight. And he titled them Art and Money, or the Story of the Room. So that's a little bit of a not so subtle hint here. But if you notice, if you look around, these are actually very expensive leather coverings on the wall, but he's covered that with a coat of shimmering Prussian blue. It's an act of what might be called creative destruction. Apparently, according to the curator of American art, Um, After Whistler finished this room in 1877, Leland told him that he would be horsewhipped if he ever appeared at the house again. Also, if he ever came near his wife again. So that's a little bit of salacious gossip for you. But Leland actually kept the work. Um, this actually occurred, at the same time. Look at these dates. It occurred at the same time as the suit against Ruskin for libel, and so he was essentially forced to file for bankruptcy. And here, oh, I meant to show you this. Here are is a close up of the peacocks. But so he's forced to file for bankruptcy, and his chief creditor was Leland, the owner of this room. So when the creditors arrived to Whistler's house and beloved studio, everything was gone except for this painting. It was greeted for them, this mocking portrait. And so this is the gold scab, eruption, and filthy lucre, the creditor. And this is depicting Leland as a hideous peacock sitting on Whistler's house as if it's this kind of obscene egg. And he's using the same colors that were featured in the disputed peacock room, and he's caricaturing Leland, whether his miserliness or his piano skills that he was very proud of. He was a bit of a dandy. His habit of wearing frilled shirts, hence the title, by the way. Frilthy is a kind of combination of frills of shirts and filthy, and he adopts this phrase filthy lucre, which means unclean gain, from the King James Bible. And in this place where it comes from, it appears 4 times to warn disciples who are seeking recompense for their teaching. So it's all about money. And if you look up at the top, you see that butterfly monogram that's Whistler's kind of signature, and it bears a barbed tail poised to strike at Leland's neck. So this is a little bit of fun to see. In all things that I admit, I just love this particular work of art. But I bring this in because Whistler is important for us because he's a proponent of a very different understanding of art, even from what we've seen from other artists at this point. And so here he's a proponent of the doctrine of art for art's sake, and he believes that true art should serve no purpose whatsoever. He said art has become foolishly confounded with education. So for Whistler, beauty was the measure of a work's ability to stimulate a pleasing aesthetic sensation. And that's why we have the aesthetic movement. But this idea that art exists to create beauty or a sense of aesthetic pleasure, I think, is really important in light of the fact that we have this over-industrialization, over-urbanization that's going on at the time, this reaction, kind of anti-modern reaction against what's happening in the culture at the moment. So I know this was kind of a whirlwind talk today, but I want us to get a kind of varied view of all these different forces, different movements going on towards the end of the 19th century, and whether it's geared towards amusement and the schemes of the world fairs, or whether it's this kind of anti-modern push of arts and crafts, of getting back to work with your hands, to root yourself and ground yourself in aesthetic pleasure, or to simply escape into aesthetic experience in Art Nouveau. But I'm curious to see what you guys think and how you're summing all these things up and rounding these things together in your responses and how you react to the reading as well as the rest of these things. But with this being our last lecture, so to speak, I want to say how much I've thoroughly enjoyed reading your work, and I'm really looking forward to your final papers. And I hope that you have a really good week. Thanks.